Seb's Soapbox. Hi, and welcome to Seb's Soapbox. This is kind of a sub-series to the This Is Hell radio podcast show. You can hear Seb's Soapbox in the future on the This Is Hell radio show, on the main show with Chuck Mertz, broadcasting live Monday through Thursday at 10 a.m. Chicago time at thisishell.com. And this is kind of my own segment. I thought I'll turn this into a live stream YouTube kind of thing where, it's another white guy sitting in front of his computer talking into a microphone about issues. But in this case, a white guy sitting in front of his computer talking about issues that make you realize that, well, this is hell. And this week, in the inaugural episode, I want to talk about, guns. And why Americans are so in love with guns, and why that is a problem. I mean, obviously, given current events, but then also always, basically, because there never is a moment in this country where we don't have to talk about guns. Or rather, there is never a moment where we can talk about guns, because now is never the time, apparently, because these issues are always happening and they're always going on. And so you always hear this argument, right, that it's not guns that kill people, it's people that kill people. From the gun people when they're defending their favorite hobby. A hobby that they maintain is enshrined in the American Constitution. But if you dig a little deeper into the whole issue, you will find that there is little truth to this. Because once you look at the history and the context of the gun issues, and you put your thinking cap on and ponder what all of these words are actually about, you will come to realize that things are not that simple. Because guns, firearms, are essentially destructive implements, and exclusively destructive implements. Pro-gun people will tell you that guns are essentially nothing but tools, basically glorified garden hose. But where a garden hoe can be used to murder someone, if you misuse it and don't use it in accordance to or for what it was actually initially created, a firearm, a gun, has very few other uses than hurting and killing. It's certainly not possible to till your garden with a gun. Maybe unless it's like a minigun and you just go all, Arnold Schwarzenegger on the soil, but that's kind of a different issue. But the insistence that owning and bearing these exclusive instruments of violence and death is a constitutionally enshrined right that must not be impeded upon in any way is in itself a very curious dilemma whenever one tries to talk to the gun folk. Insisting that a citizen must be allowed to purchase, own, carry, and brandish an instrument of death at all times with no restrictions is in itself something, something that I have a reflex towards of describing as fundamentally fascistic. Not because I don't like guns, not because I don't understand how guns work. No, there is some pretty important reasons for how I arrive at this point. Because this is ultimately about more than just property rights, although gun rights and property rights are closely intertwined. Because ultimately, owning and bearing firearms in America is about having the possibility at hand to quickly and effortlessly end the life of your fellow human beings at any time that you choose. Essentially, this reading of the constitutional amendment says that all American citizens at all times have the right to have the possibility to end someone else's life, or their own life, basically. just look at the firearm statistics. Most firearm deaths in this country are suicides, after all. And so this reading effectively grants all American citizens the power to decide who lives and who dies at any given moment. And that is what is essentially fascistic about the whole gun issue. Well, one of the points that makes the whole gun issue essentially fascistic. Because, well, and this will always be couched behind all sorts of high-minded arguments, all of which essentially try to defend claiming a right that is in and of itself indefensible, or should be indefensible, in a modern nation state. Because in a modern nation state, the state has what you call a monopoly on violence. That means that the only people who, within reason granted, can enact violence upon the citizens are employees of the state, representatives of the state. And to some people, this sounds like a surefire way into a dictatorship, because the people can't fight back against the state. Only the state can do violence. But once you start thinking about this a bit more than just at a surface level, the absurdity of an argument against a strict state monopoly on violence should become clear. Because if the state doesn't have a monopoly on violence, then why does the state exist in the first place? And stop cheering now, anarchists and libertarians. That was not the point. A state needs to maintain the monopoly on violence to protect its citizens. That's why laws exist. You can't go ahead and, unless it happens in a very narrowly defined exception, hurt others, even if they hurt you first. Only the state can legally remedy that hurt. Whether or not the state does so efficiently, equitably, and justly, that's sadly a matter for another time. And no, my general disdain for police does not invalidate this point. I am all for a state monopoly on violence, but I can't disagree with the way that any given state utilizes this monopoly. I am sure also that my personal position has a lot to do with me having grown up in a country that has fairly strict gun laws. A country that, by and large, takes the state monopoly on violence very seriously. I personally take the state monopoly on violence very seriously. Something like Kyle Rittenhouse should not happen in a well-run society, nor should something like George Zimmerman, for that matter. But I will delve into the awfulness of stand-your-ground laws and the castle doctrine and all that other nonsense some other time. But let me just point out that in a well-functioning society, there should simply be no leeway for any form of vigilantism. And that starts by not having a society that's armed to the teeth. So if you compare the situation in Germany, for example, which is the one place I have experience with, so excuse me for going there again, buying a gun in Germany is by no means impossible, but it's also by no means an easy endeavor. Because in Germany, a potential gun buyer needs to essentially first make the case towards the state as to why they need a firearm in the first place. Then the gun buyer needs to go through a large stack of paperwork, file for a bunch of licenses, either join a hunter's organization or an athletic shooting club, get a hunting license. Then they need to buy a gun safe, and then they also always need to keep ammunition and firearms separate, unless, and if they want to get a carry license, unless they can prove to the state that they personally, as an individual, are more in danger than the average citizen. And then they can apply for a carrying license. So owning guns in Germany is possible, and sure, quite a few people own guns, but it is really not easy. And all of these things, like all of these gun control measures where it's like, it's not easy to get a gun, but it's possible, they still run against the various notions in American society of, like, first, the whole sense of entitlement because of the wrong reading of the Second Amendment by the Supreme Court. I'll get there. And Americans' notion of self-defense, the need for self-defense. Because how is a law-abiding American citizen supposed to defend his family, and it's usually men here, from an intruder if he first has to open the gun safe, load the gun before shooting the threat dead? And here I should also mention that in this scenario / mental image, the American citizen is usually understood as a white male, and the intruder is usually understood to be black or non-white, and usually also male. And please, nobody get at me now with black-on-black violence or any other such racist nonsense. That is something I can delve into another time. Why that is nonsense? Why that is just complete... no, it's not really an argument against anything. But ultimately, all of this gets down to the fact that the current spree of mass shootings has a close connection to the widespread ready availability of firearms. But there's also something deeper in all of this, because Americans apparently simply don't value the life of their fellow citizens terribly much. And doubly so when those fellow citizens seem to be threatening their property. Which is a good apropos. Property. A part of the religious zealotry that surrounds guns in America is rooted in the religious zealotry that surrounds property. The right to own guns is, as at its basic level, the right to a specific kind of property. There could be an argument that people have the right to own and bear arms, but that their right to use them is strictly limited, which one of the many ways of talking around the issue is exactly that. You're not really getting at it, because owning something essentially does imply the ability to use that something. And the right to own an instrument of violence implies the right to enact violence. In many ways, the argument for gun ownership rights that are made today resemble the arguments proponents of slavery made in the pre-Civil War era against abolition. I've read quite a few of these, and it's always kind of interesting how much things stay the same over time. If you go into the primary sources and read the voices of enslavers as to why the state has no right to tell them what to do with their property, which in this case happens to be human beings, because the state, according to the slave holders, and also, I guess, according to the gun rights people, has to honor property rights. I mean, sure, their state has to honor property rights. They are enshrined in the Fifth Amendment. No matter what the property is, the state cannot tell you to get rid of a certain kind of property, according to the Fifth Amendment. Not without recompensating you for that. But of course, the right to own guns as property is now double enshrined in the Constitution. You have the Fifth Amendment where the state can't tell you what to do with things that you own, and you have the Second Amendment that, under the current reading, basically guarantees you that you can buy almost any kind of gun. But things have not always been this way, and this is where it becomes really interesting. So, if you ask the average American, they might assume that individual rights to gun ownership were always constitutionally guaranteed. After all, the Second Amendment is, well, old. But they would be mistaken, because this current reading of the Second Amendment, granting every American citizen unimpedable rights to gun ownership and gun carrying, is actually very, very recent. And I'll let you guess who was president when that reading changed. Any guesses? Was it William Henry Harrison? Was it Woodrow Wilson? Was it Lyndon B. Johnson? Oh, none of these. How about George W. Bush? Yeah, it was George W. Bush. Because in June 2008, in the District of Columbia v. Heller decision, the hyper-reactionary Supreme Court, under the leadership of confirmed gun nut Antonin Scalia, decided that the Second Amendment did guarantee each individual citizen the right to own firearms, and that they could basically do with these firearms whatever they wanted, as long as the thing that they wanted to do with them was lawful, and that's kind of another thing that we should get to. The court decided that unlike the reading of the amendment up to that point, that the Second Amendment did not mean that owning and bearing arms was to be connected with service in a militia, but that it was instead an individual right. That this was a new interpretation and has had awful consequences, especially in combination with the expiration of the federal assault weapons ban in 2004. And so, especially if we keep other current events in mind, for those taking count here, this current reading of the Second Amendment, that every single citizen can own and carry whatever gun they want, is actually only 14 years old. Meanwhile, the now even more hyper-reactionary Supreme Court is arguing that the right to abortions, on the other hand, is not quote-unquote traditional and has no rooting in American, tradition, while that right in itself is more than twice as old as the right to wave guns around. Now, getting back to why is all of this ultimately fascistic? Because didn't the Nazis outlaw gun ownership? Actually, no. No, I'm sorry, they didn't. If you look at, for example, what anthropologist Abigail Cohn wrote in her 2004 book, Shooters, The Myths and Realities of America's Gun Culture, you will find that the Weimar Republic, the predecessor to the Nazi regime in Germany, actually had very strict gun laws, which the Nazis then came and loosened first for party members, then for members of the military, and then also just for German citizens at large, while they strengthened the gun laws against population they saw as less deserving. And as several other historians pointed out, Germany's Jewish population at the time was fairly small in the 1930s, so even if Jews had been fully armed, the possibility that an armed Jewry could have staved off the Holocaust that was enacted on them by the German majority population and by the Nazi terror state is an absurdly counterfactual argument to make. But anyway, why are gun rights like this then essentially fascistic? And this basically means that we have to look at gun rights like in a broader context of just American politics, because the current reading of the Second Amendment is very much in line with American individualism. Citizens can become single-person militias without belonging to a well-organized militia of several people, which seems like a libertarian take and thus counter to anything fascist or tyrannical, if you want to believe that anything that libertarian is against fascism or tyranny, but I don't really buy that. But anyway, that this is still too mild a reading of gun rights, because essentially the right to own firearms must be understood as the right to inflict violence upon others, or at the very minimum as a right to threaten violence against others. Because if you run around carrying an assault rifle or even just a handgun, very well visible in a holster on your hip or on your person in some other capacity, that is always kind of like an implicit threat display, right? That's the only way you can really understand this. It's a, hey, hi, I'm here. I can kill you with ease anytime I want to. And a political system that gains backing by promising those who support it to allow those who support it to enact violence upon others can only really be called fascist. Whether the violence promised is enacted by individuals or by a collective does not matter in this instance. If in politics I go up there and say, vote for me and I'll let you bully those who don't like, vote for me and I will let you bully those that you do not like, and those who get bullied by you will not be able to stop you from doing that, then that is quite a fascist argument to make. But I'm a historian, and so I have to concede that there is more going on here. There are entire historiographies on the history of firearms and the cultures surrounding them in the United States. And a phenomenon like mass shootings, like literally everything else in the world, that any historian worth their salt will tell you, has more than a single cause. And in this case, I would connect mass shootings to the American homicide rate in general and then go from there to see where we end up, because the American homicide rate in general is fairly high among industrialized nations of the so-called first world. What I think fuels this is a fundamental distrust between Americans. One of the most important implements that most American doomsday preppers, for example, include to take to their bunkers are firearms. And firearms in this case basically come in to fend off the neighbor who wasn't as good as prepping and shambles over after the bombs have fallen and the dust is somewhat settled to your bunker and asks for a can of peas. And there is just no solidarity in this situation, only suspicion and looking out for oneself. Basically saying, tough luck, buddy, you should have prepped better. Now skedaddle, or else. And this gets worse, of course, once race comes into the mix, which has always been there, by the way. If you look at the Second Amendment, it has to be understood as fundamentally racist and as fundamentally pro-slavery. Because, well, just look at the environment that this amendment was written in. This addition to the Constitution was ratified in December of 1791. And kids, do you remember what happened in September? Not in September. Do you remember what also happened in 1791? Well, it's not something they really teach you in school, especially not now that we're no longer allowed to talk about, the darker aspects of the American past. How about the Haitian Revolution? Anybody got that? Yeah, the Haitian Revolution also began in 1791, in which black enslaved people started to violently rise up against their quote-unquote owners. And the Haitian Revolution, for decades and decades to come, scared the bejesus out of the southern planter class, who were essentially always afraid that the black people they had enslaved would have enough of the whip and decide to just go all Nat Turner on their lily white behinds. And that's where the Second Amendment ultimately comes from. That is what it's supposed to enable. It's supposed to enable militias. It's supposed to enable states to call up militias to oppose slave uprisings. Of course, today there are still similar issues in America because, well, history rhymes. The descendants of those slave-holding ding-dongs are now scared that black people have enough of living in the ghetto and will come out to party like it's Los Angeles in 1992. I mean, just look at the gun sales that skyrocketed after Barack Obama, the first American president, the first American black president, was elected, which also, of course, coincided with the Heller decision because, well, nothing ever, as I said, has a single cause. So Americans distrust each other, and American society is extremely atomized. The country's social cohesion is increasingly failing, and that is what contributes to a high homicide rate and to this plague of mass shootings. Because life isn't worth much here, unless it's one's own, or one's own family's. There is an all-pervasive selfishness that underpins a lot of these issues, and that ultimately underpins a lot of conservative ideology. Everything for me and mine, nothing for you and yours, unless you can very clearly show me what you've done to deserve, to earn things for you and yours. Of course, pointing out these things in a YouTube show or podcast or whatever can only ever scratch the surface of a format like this. This is not a book. This is not a policy proposal. Also, there is, of course, the question of what can be done and what indeed should be done. There is also still a lot, and really a lot more to the whole issue than things that I, as a white man from Germany who happens to live here, can really be aware of. I mean, I try to be aware of a lot of things, but I have my own perspective, and I have to concede that my own perspective is by necessity, by human nature, limited. For example, if you ask some black people about gun control laws, you will certainly hear a very different opinion from mine. As activist and musician Michael Render, who you all probably know better as Killer Mike from Run the Jewels, they're great, points out, if gun control laws are enacted, the people who will suffer from them the most, the ones who will be disarmed the fastest, will be black people. And that is a horrible point to consider, but knowing anything about the American legal system, there is a point to all of that. Because after all, the National Rifle Association used to be for gun control laws. When those gun control laws targeted the Black Panthers. So carrying of firearms in Ronald Reagan's California, so when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, was curtailed explicitly because, well, you can't have black people running around arming themselves, which is a point that legal scholar Adam Winkler pointed out in his 2013 book, Gunfight, The Battle to Bear Arms in America. And these days, instead of curtailing gun rights, police simply seem to just enforce existing gun rights and gun laws differently, depending on what race you belong to, as various social science experiments found, in which first a white person open carries firearms in proximity to police and nothing happens, and then in contrast, a black person open carries in proximity to police and then they only barely escape with their life. Of course, those experiments could, in theory, constitute only anecdotal rather than systemic evidence. But given that American police like to shoot black people for pretty much anything, regardless of whether they are armed or not, while white mass shooters get treated with silk gloves and are carted off to Burger King, these findings do not seem to be too far off. So ultimately, what should be done? So first of all, I think we have to come to an understanding that owning implements whose only real purpose is enacting or threatening violence upon others can't be something that the state has no right to say anything about. Because the modern states simply have to maintain a monopoly on violence. That's just how the world works. There is ultimately no good argument for this that isn't based in a desire to inflict deadly harm or threaten other people with deadly harm. And essentially to take up the individual right to about who lives and who dies. And now some people will want to say, but what about this, but what about that? And well, none of those things, other things ultimately matter. But I am talking about a very high-level hypothetical here in terms of actions and goals and fundamental change in mindsets. Once we understand that ownership of guns implies a right to decide about the lives of other people, that ownership of guns implies the right to bully our fellow citizens, and that these simply should not be rights to exist in the first place, we might end up having a chance to change things. There is also a need to recognize an even higher level issue. American society desperately needs to become less atomized, desperately needs to become less hyper-individualistic. Americans, and I include myself here, even if I don't have citizenship, need to learn to trust each other again. A society in which people are generally less suspicious of one another is a society in which the life of the other is valued again. A society in which we think of ourselves as part of a greater whole and not just as atomized individuals pursuing their own self-interest, who are in constant contest and competition with one another. That would be a society in which in which lives have worth again. And that is a society in which people would see that it is a grotesque idea that anyone and everyone should at any given time have the right to end the life of another, or at least implicitly threaten to do so by brandishing an implement of death and violence that they believe is their right because people who believed in witchcraft supposedly meant to say so over 200 years ago. Thanks for listening. I'll get down from the soapbox now. And tune in this Tuesday, or any Tuesday, at 10 a.m. Central Time at thisishell.com for the next full episode of God's favorite radio show.